Hello, 你好. Welcome to Mandarin Mama Chit Chat by Mandarin Together, where two Taiwanese moms, Trista and Yao Yao, share their experiences in raising bilingual children, exploring identity, code switching, and embracing the joys and challenges of bilingual parenting. Come along with us on this exciting journey.
Hey guys, I want to let you know we have a Mandarin mini number course that is out. Make sure you go check it out in our link bio. I will link it in show notes. In this mini course, you'll learn how to say 1 to 99 in Mandarin Chinese in just 12 minutes. It includes a video training. We will teach you how to write 1 to 10 in Mandarin character, how to calculate your lucky numbers, and you will learn all the unlucky numbers and lucky number in Chinese culture. We also include in this mini course a lot of activity sheets, coloring sheets for the kids to work on to make it fun. So make sure you go check it out. And as always, we also have lots of freebie for you to download. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm so excited for today's episode. We have an expert on. This episode, we have Katrina. Katrina is a bilingualism specialist. She doesn't only focus on bilingual, she also focuses in trilingual. She brought so much knowledge in this episode. I was so intrigued on everything she was saying. She's such an expert on learning a language, bilingualism and trilingualism. As I was speaking to her, in this episode, I had a lot of reflect back on me learning a new language, learning English. I didn't grow up in a bilingual setting. I grew up in Taiwan. I moved to US when I was 14. So I started learning English when I was 14. Now my kids are in the bilingual setting. So I'm just reflecting back on their way of learning and my way of learning growing up. And we talk about things like accent, code switching, learning a new language at different ages. A lot of she said just brought lots of comfort in my heart, and her approach just so positive. She just is such a good teacher, and she brought a lot of hope. Also, she brought me permission to be a mediocre mom that's trying to teach my kids Mandarin. Permission to be not on top of it all the time. Permission to be, depending on my circumstances, I might not be able to, teach my kids read and write or set a really high goal for their bilingual journey. And even permission for myself as right now a bilingual person, for me to be okay that, I speak two languages. I know I'm not good at both. As you were here in this episode, I shared that I grew up in Taiwan. I moved to the US when I was 14. So my Mandarin is basically middle school level, and then moved to US to Florida for 4 years, and then moved to Houston, and then started immediately hanging out with friends that only speak in Mandarins. And then I also stopped school for a little bit. So that caused like my English to not be so fluent. So I always have this insecurity that, my Mandarin is not fluent, nor does my English. Like in living here in the US, I always worry, people judge me, I'll get stuck on words and make grammar mistake and an accent. That's always back in my head, being a language learner and just feel like not dominant at either language. But, thanks to Katrina, it makes me, after speaking to her after this episode, I feel better. I just need to give permission to myself that it's okay, we might have different accents. Some people might be a strong language learner, some people are not. Some people can speak 5 languages and have no accent. And to be honest, sometimes nobody's judging us. The only one who's judging us is ourselves, right? So yes, I really enjoy speaking to Katrina. Really inspired me and telling myself that it's okay. We just keep learning and keep growing in this language journey. And it's never too late to learn a language. So everybody, all the mommies out there, all the parents out there, Let's relax. We can do this. And let's welcome Katrina.
Hey, Katrina, welcome joining us today. First, do you mind just share a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became interested in bilingualism, especially focusing in children?
Yeah, so I feel like it's kind of like a weird, just like random sort of pathway that's like led me to do my thesis and all my work. So I actually didn't grow up like in my home bilingual. I grew up in Canada, so I learned French at school, went to French immersion schools. But in my home, I guess we were sort of like the typical three-generation language shift where my grandparents were from Finland, my mom grew up speaking Finnish, and then didn't raise us in Finnish, so we don't have that language anymore. So we went through, and then I moved to Spain at 18. I was an au pair, which is kind of like a nanny. And I did that for a year, was like helping the kids sort of learn English, and then decided to go into linguistics. And then sort of the path just naturally through sort of the academic world sort of led me to be really interested in how second language acquisition. So I've worked with adults and then now sort of specifically with bilingual kids and heritage language kids, especially. So kids that learn the language at home as part of their heritage. So that's sort of how I have sort of stumbled into where I am. But it's good.
Do you speak Spanish yourself?
Yes.
Because you live in Spain.
Yes, I speak Spanish.
So when you say bilingualism, are you focused like just like a broader generation? But do you like when you work with kids or families, is it like maybe could be Mandarin and English or like, like a broader there's just like multiple languages or like exclusively English and Spanish?
Yeah, so my research is actually, so we use bilingualism, at least in academic fields, to be like really broad. So it also includes people that speak 3 languages, 4 languages, 10 languages. Like it's sort of, I don't know, the word people use. So my current research is actually trilingual research. Most of my research has actually been trilingual research. So I'm in Spain in Barcelona, which is a Catalan speaking region. So all my kids, at least in my research right now, are by sort of default, they speak English at home, Spanish, Catalan at school, and everywhere else. And then I've worked on other projects too in Canada there's like French, English, English, Spanish. I was working for a while actually with Mandarin heritage speakers in adulthood who were learning Spanish and Russian heritage speakers who were learning Spanish in adulthood. So it's sort of like a very broad definition I feel like people use to like say bilingualism and being just like anything more than one language.
So I personally actually have a question. So you know how in the, I guess, early days or in the past, people were saying if kids were raised bilingual or like, grew up with multiple languages, it would hinder, it's bound to happen to have speech delay in early days, but I guess a hindrance would disappear or they would overcome. But a newer theory, at least based on my understanding, is that that's a myth. That's inaccurate. The kids could still reach, I guess, would not experience speech delay, even if they were exposed to multiple languages at an early age. Could you share your insights with us on that, since you're so versed in bilingualism, especially with kids?
Yeah, so I feel like that's sort of the big one, and that's like the one that stops a lot of parents. And definitely in the past, I think we're seeing sort of like the ramifications of that advice from speech therapists, from pediatricians, from teachers who would tell parents, especially parents, like immigrant parents, you need to speak in English. So the kids are getting this like less quality English. That's not really helping their English development. And they're also losing that sort of like cultural connection and not learning their heritage language over this fear that they would be speech delayed. But all modern scientific evidence points to the fact that bilingual children, multilingual children, like our brain is hardwired. If the conditions are right and optimal and there's consistent input, humans are wired to learn lots of languages. We are wired to become multilinguals, bilinguals, monolinguals. It depends on sort of the systems around us, but we're wired to learn language and to communicate with those around us. And we do it in the same period as a monolingual will. So all the milestones that a kid should meet, like the time they start speaking, first words, putting two words together, all of that is going to happen at the same time as a monolingual. So you're going to see the same things. So if your kid isn't speaking, it's not bilingualism. It's, whatever else causes speech delays, which a speech therapist would know more about what exactly causes those, but it's never going to be bilingualism as the cause. And bilingualism never has to be like taken out in order to like work on one language. So you can support one language in both. The other thing is speech delays, speech disorders are always going to occur in both languages. So there's not going to happen only in English, but not in Mandarin, or only in Mandarin and not in English. Like you're going to see the same things in both languages for it to qualify as like a true speech delay, which is also why like current recommendations are always that children get tested in both languages. So they do, if they're doing some like norm reference tests, they do them in both languages because you want to see, is it a dominance thing? Of course, maybe they're testing in one language really, really well and one language not well at all. Okay, maybe that's other factors. They're not getting enough input in that language. Or they could be more balanced and high, also not a concern. But if you're seeing that both languages are really, really low, then that's probably indicative of some sort of speech disorder, speech delay, etc. So I feel like that one's probably the biggest myth, the biggest one stopping and still happening. I mean, we still see it where parents will be like, you have to focus on one language first. And it's not the case. It's not backed up by any sort of research evidence, at least in the last like 20 years.
My niece, she's learning 3 languages. Her mom is from Ecuador. They speak Spanish. My sister-in-law speaks to my niece in Spanish, but she speaks English at school. And for us and grandparents speak Mandarin to her. So do you see a lot of kids that's kind of, and she's 3, by the way, she's 3. So she gets confused. If she say like a sentence, you'll see like a quarter of English and little Spanish here and then Mandarin there, like in one sentence. Do you see that a lot on the younger kids? They just, I guess, confused.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing with little kids being confused is like, they're not confused. I mean, it might come out as sort of this like confusion, like, oh, they don't have the words, they don't have the language. But really it's sort of like a natural path that a lot of bilingual and trilingual kids will sort of take. And it's sort of how they will adapt to maybe not having the same vocabulary in all their languages. So for example, if a monolingual kid doesn't know the word cup, they're going to use other sort of resources to try and find the word. They're going to say like the bowl to mean the cup. But a trilingual kid might have the word in one language. So they'll say that word in the one language to do like this code switching. It also depends on who they're speaking with. So if they know people around them speak both languages, they might code switch more because they know they're going to be understood if they're switching. But most kids will sort of, depending on the environment they're in, either stop or continue to switch depending on the environment that they're in, how much their parents code switch. Like if they hear it a lot in their environment, they're more likely to code switch. So they're not necessarily confused. They're just sort of like passing through this phase or doing what's heard frequently from their caregivers and other people around them.
Since you mentioned code switching, right? So I'm curious, would you say, because I know there are different, I guess, theories too. Some people have, I don't know, stigma or frown upon code switching. What are your opinions on code switching? Because some people, I know like some people say, oh, you're lazy, right? You should stick with one language. And then so you're proficient in all languages that you speak versus you are not as proficient in all languages, right? Like what are your opinions on code switching?
Yeah, I think code switching and the science behind code switching, I'm not really someone that looks at code switching, but a lot of the science behind it is actually really cool because I do think it has this stigma of being, oh, it's something because you're not proficient enough to speak or you don't know the words, all of this stuff. But the interesting part about code switching is it's very, especially in adult speakers and in older kids, it's very regulated on who you can code switch with, when you can code switch. Like you're not going to code switch as an adult with somebody who doesn't speak the other language because that's going to make no sense. So it has to be within sort of an environment with people who can also get this sort of code switching. So you'll see areas that are very, very highly proficient bilingual. So big examples would be like here in Barcelona, everyone's Spanish and Catalan. So you'll be talking to someone in Spanish and then they'll throw these Catalan words all the time or vice versa. Same with like places in New York with Spanish English, and Miami is another good example where it's everyone is bilingual. Everyone has this ability to different extents. that it's so regulated. So of course they can code switch in there. But if they left, they would stick to their one language because that's sort of the rule. We know it happens more with parents who code switch a lot. So I think it gets a really bad rep, but it's actually like quite a regulated process with rules. So even in the sentence, people that code switch aren't going to break grammatical rules in either language. So if you're code switching, you can't like code switch. You're going to, for example, in English and in Spanish, we have the determiner and like the noun. So you're going to have to, most Spanish speakers will code switch and have like the connection between those words. You can't break it. You can't say like the wrong determiner with the noun in English. Like there's rules that are people don't think about, but that are happening when they're code switching. So you can't break rules in either language. So it's very regulated in terms of like how code switching works. I think it gets a very bad rap, but it's actually it's very high. Like to be a proficient code switcher, know when to code switch, who to code switch with, requires like a lot more not even mental effort, but a lot more like proficiency than it just being like, oh, you're not proficient. You can't hold a conversation in your language. And sometimes it's just words work better. Like I think a lot of bilinguals find that some words just mean something more. There's more semantic value to some words that they code switch a lot with. So people will be like words about love, words about family. Those things are words that very frequently are code switched because there's like more of a connection in one language as opposed to sort of the other. So those words are like going to come out whenever they can, I think. But code switching is interesting.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you say that because we code switch a lot at our household. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and it makes so much sense because even myself, like I code switch here in the US in Houston, even when I'm hanging out with my friends, sometimes we just, we speak Mandarin, I'll say 80% of the time, but we're just like throwing some, not on purpose, but it's just natural, like some words, we're throwing some English words. Like we say, like it'll be like Mandarin, like, oh, like, so it's just, if I go back to Taiwan, go back to my hometown, when I speak to my friends and my family, my grandparents, I don't code switch because they won't be able to understand. So I'll just sometimes maybe take me a little bit to express what I have to say, like certain vocabulary. I might have to like pause for a little bit, but I know I can't code switch because they have zero understanding of English. So it makes a lot of sense. And actually same with my kids, they code switch here, but when they go back, they can't. So they'll squeeze everything they have. And sometimes it's hard. They'll come up to me like, how do I say this to grandma? But they know they can't code switch to grandma or great-great-grandparents because they don't understand. So it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I think that's also interesting. It's just like in general, as humans using language, we're actually quite lazy. We are always going to take the path of least resistance. We're always going to choose a language that is more comfortable for us. So we see the same with heritage kids that aren't speaking because it's more comfortable for them to speak a language they're dominant in. With sounds even, we're lazy about how we produce them. We're like the humans in speech, we want to do the fastest, most effective way to get our words across and our speech across. And so oftentimes for highly proficient bilinguals, it is going to be, especially with like vocab, it is going to be more efficient for you to just say the word in English, especially in cases where you maybe don't have a translation equivalent or words that, like especially newer words, like newer technology words or words that have now come into your vocab in English. You're like, wait, I actually might not know that in this other language because I learned it in English and it's a new thing. And I think you even find it somewhere, I'm not sure about like in Taiwan, but I know here in Spain, there's a lot of words that I'll hear on the street. And I'm like, that's an English word. Like they've adapted it into Spanish, but you're just like, they're not code switching, but it's just a word. And I was like, oh, I was wondering what that word is in Spanish, but they might not even maybe have the word. Like they're using these borrowed words. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, when you say that, I went back to Taiwan and I was asking my friend, hey, how do you say podcast in Mandarin? Because even though it's Mandarin, some words is different from mainland China and Taiwan. I think there is a word for podcast in mainland China. So I was like, hey, this is how you say it. My friends are not really. We don't even say that here. That's just only, they say that in China, but we don't say it. We just say podcast. I was like, really? Like just English podcast? She's like, yeah, that's, everyone say podcast. I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Cause I was trying to like, I want to explain to my mom and my grandparents what I'm doing. But I was like, I need like a Mandarin word. But the younger, they might not even know what podcast.
Yeah.
I told them like, what is podcast? But I was like, okay, there's not really a word to describe it. Cause all like our generation, they just say podcast in Taiwan. Now, there's not like a word to say.
Yeah, I think it's like with English being sort of like the international sort of language, so much of like the tech words that are coming in are English, and you're thinking so long, like, wait, how do I say this in this language? And you're like, oh no, I just have to say it in this way, and they'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I teach Mandarin here in the U.S., right? And sometimes my students would ask me, high school students, so older kids, they would ask me how to say certain words in Mandarin, and I'm like, sometimes take me a minute, and there is actually one, but sometimes like we just don't have one in English, in Mandarin. So what Yao Yao said was very, or sometimes how do you say present in Mandarin? There is a word present, but people just say, oh, Mandarin, like tomorrow I'm going to present. 我明天要 present. Just like it's interesting how much English has I don't want to insert itself, but impact other languages as well. So it's really cool to hear other languages too, not just Mandarin, because I only know Mandarin English. So I don't know like how other languages are being influenced by English. But that's really cool. And language is like a living thing too, it's ever changing. But it's really interesting to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's exactly that. It's always changing. And so I think right now we're in an English moment where English is sort of like everyone's very scared of English coming and taking over. But I mean, other languages have also had this, right? So English has a ton of words that were brought in from Spanish, that were brought in from the indigenous languages. Same with French. English and French have a huge shared vocabulary that we don't think of anymore because the word has just been in the lexicon in English speakers for so long that we've changed the pronunciation so much. Even last year I was teaching English here, and there was one section on words and guessing where they came from. And I'm pretty sure the word ketchup in English comes from Mandarin.
Oh.
It comes from some word meaning sauce in Mandarin. I don't know what the word is, but it comes, and it's so into English now that we think of it as a super English word. We pronounce it very English, but like the traces of the word are actually from Asia, which is interesting.
That's fascinating.
So everyone has their influence on the world.
Now, would you suggest starting the second language as early, or the mother tongue as early as possible? I saw one of your reel. You said even when you're pregnant, it starts that early on. Can you like tell us about it?
Yeah. So I feel like, so there's this whole critical age debate in everywhere. I think everyone's sort of heard about this, like, oh, if you start too late, you're never going to get to these levels. And I feel like the more I've been in academics, the more I've been thinking, like, which is why I sort of started my consulting and started my like Instagram and everything, is because I've been like, but does it matter? Like, does it matter if we don't sound like a native speaker? Like, why is that our goal? Why is our goal to do this? So in general, we would say the earlier, the better, if you can. But I think the most important thing, especially with heritage languages and raising kids to be bilingual, is it's all going to be about like consistency and like maintaining input over a really long period of time. So if that means like you can't start until the kid is 2 because your circumstances in your life aren't going to make it possible, it's okay. If you have like sort of the ability though to start as early as possible, of course you can maybe start listening to their moms in the womb, so they do come out recognizing the sound of their mother's voice, preferring the languages if their mother speaks 2 languages. So if they hear the mother who's pregnant speaking English sometimes, Mandarin sometimes, they'll come out with equal preference to both languages at birth. So it's really never too late or early to start, but it's also not too late either. You can start learning a language as an adult if you want, if you have, the resources, the time, the desire, the motivation. But yeah, a lot of the stuff, especially with like habit setting, is easier the earlier your baby is around, because you can get into sort of doing the habits, doing the routines. All of that is much easier to set when kids have, less of a say in their sort of less direction for themselves.
Yes. Or what I've been hearing is like, you start young, start young. And what I'm hearing from you, I'm really glad to hear that because I guess what you're saying is it's never too late because everyone have different circumstances. And that's what I think too. And I changed my goal when my kids were younger, I was pushing it really hard and I was setting high goal, on reading, writing Mandarin. But then circumstances change. She's older now and then fighting a lot of resistance. And that's the second question I want to ask you about resistance. So now I'm like dialing it back and more focusing on conversation and focusing on the culture, make sure she loves where we came from, like Taiwan. My goal is for her to be able to speak Mandarin, can converse with my family in Taiwan. So, and like you said earlier, which is so true, that's what my thought was too. Like if they really have that determination when they grow up, they want to pick that up on reading, writing, they can always do that, right? Um, so yeah. And I want to ask you about resistance, like for older kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Older kids are, they're their own group. So I think what we've always sort of found in language research is there's sort of around 6 is when things start to sort of change for heritage speakers. So around 6, to be honest, I think this age might be a little bit earlier now because a lot of this age comes from research from like 20 years ago and data from 20 years ago when kids started school at 6, right? So now it's very common. It's like here kids start school at 3. In Canada, they start school around the same time. So kids start school earlier, get immersed in the community language much earlier. But yeah, so I think kids eventually, which is something I think that's always interesting, right? Because you get a lot of focus on like what parents can do. So what can parents do to make their kids speak, especially when they're little? How much input do you need to be giving your kids in order to have them grow up successful? But there does become a point where input matters less and output is what is going to sort of predict proficiency, skills, desire to continue, right? Because you can keep talking in a language as much as you want, but if they're not understanding and they're not producing as they get older, their proficiency and their ability is of course gonna drop. So I think for me the thing is always like it has to be in some way connected to culture, not having these crazy goals, these crazy expectations, especially with like reading and writing. Because of course, is it great if the kid wants to learn how to read and write and has those abilities? Absolutely. But if it's like at risk of just not speaking or not wanting to partake at all in any of these sorts of things, then it might be a goal to shift because reading and writing, if you're going to learn how to do it in the community language, it's a skill that can be transferred instead of having to spend your whole time on Sundays with your mom, learning how to read and write. So yeah, I think it's really also about tapping into sort of like their desires. What do they like to do? How can you find a way to do that in the heritage language? So if they like to cook, can you get a cookbook sent to you? Can you do FaceTimes with grandparents back home to like learn how to do a traditional recipe? Can you go on the internet and find a recipe that you have to follow, which is a way you can also get some reading and writing, but at least you're going to be doing, following the instructions in Mandarin, working together to cook, same with like science experiments or whatever the kids are interested in, being able to do that in the heritage language. Setting like goals for themselves is also a good thing. And like really, we also know peers can be really helpful. So if there's any way to sort of connect with anybody else who also speaks the heritage language that's around the same age, either in the city or in the area you live, which depending on the heritage language can be more or less difficult. It depends, where you are. So if there is a community, like being able to tap into that. But if not, there's so many now communities online where kids can, get together, meet, friends and family back home, like FaceTime, all of that stuff can be really helpful for the kids having this desire to speak because they see other kids speaking. They see sort of like the value and the need, right? I think also with kids, it's sometimes about giving them the need. So like we were saying earlier, to talk to your grandparents, talk to your parents. They know they can't code switch. They know they can't go back. And so they want to do that. And they know they can't revert like they can with their own parents, right? They know their parents speak English, but if they know, okay, I'm speaking to this person who doesn't speak, we only have this language in common, they're going to be much more likely to produce it. They have nothing to fall back on. You have to just do it. Even if it's not as comfortable, you have to do it in these sort of circumstances. So those can be a good way too.
Yeah, that's really helpful because I guess I'm always, so when you mention like kids now, the reason it starts earlier, that's so true because my eldest is 4-year-old right now, but so I speak Mandarin to him, Mandarin English, right? But at age 3, he told me, "Mommy, speak English." Like he actually requests me whenever I speak Mandarin to him. He has this identity or just like wanting, be more aware of the differences, and he chooses one over the other. At first, it was shocked, surprised, but a little bit hurt, I would say. So now I'm trying to like how to make kind of what you say, incorporate Mandarin, right? Learning any elements into things he's interested in, he likes, and trying to build a community. Still navigating, but this is really helpful to have. I don't know, just like taking notes and like learning from your advice. And then I have a follow-up question, right? So we're talking about so much about bilingualism and, the stigma about, the myth and things like that. But what about the benefits about bilingualism or multilingualism, right? And then that would be a good, I don't know, inspiring, encouraging, like the parents or people who want to do that. And what are the benefits if you speak multiple languages?
Yeah, I think I personally try and stay away from the academic and the cognitive benefits because for me, the research is very iffy. It's not done by linguists. It's very, we don't know. But I mean, there's this empathy connection, right? So kids that understand another language are going to probably be maybe a bit more empathetic because they understand and they live these two lives in these two languages. I think the biggest one is always going to be a connection to your culture because language is transmitted and culture is transmitted through language, right? So to have both, it's much stronger. Like, of course, you can still identify with your culture, even if you don't speak the language. But if you do speak the language, you can connect to it in a different way than you can if you're only getting translated or like interpreted versions. So I think for familiar like connections too, maybe it doesn't directly impact the connection with the parent if you speak the language of the dominant language. You might still be able to have that connection. But if you don't, that connection could be more iffy. Same with grandparents, extended family, all of this stuff will be impacted if like the language is completely out of the life, completely lost. So I think like the cultural one is always sort of the biggest one. Like how can you make language and culture really connected? How can you make sure your kids are connected in that way to their culture? I think that's sort of the biggest benefit. We also know that speaking two languages makes learning more languages easier as an adult. So heritage kids and people that learn two languages as children have an easier time learning a third language, for example, because they already have in their mind two languages with two different systems, so they can transfer systems easier. So if you know two languages, learning a third language is easier. So I feel like that's also kind of like a hidden benefit, especially for kids with these heritage languages that parents might not feel are super academic or economically beneficial for their kids. I think there's sort of this, oh, well, my language is only spoken in this one area and it's not as international as Spanish or even Mandarin might be. So it's only going to be beneficial for speaking to their grandparents. But it could be that, okay, you can speak these two languages. But then when the kid gets older and they decide, oh, I wish I could speak French or German because I want to move there, they already have two languages. They have two systems to transfer. They can learn the third faster. So that's, I feel like, a hidden benefit that maybe not every parent knows about either.
Thank you for sharing that, though. I'm actually a bit surprised that hasn't been a lot of research backup, like studies in terms of the cognitive development, things like that. Because I feel guilty to admit, because try to encourage students, right, like hype them up to learn multiple languages, being a world language teacher. I was like, oh, here are the benefits. Like usually day one for new students, like here are the benefits, right? But I have to look into it, knowing that they are not really.
The cognitive benefits are interesting. I think it's pretty pop science. So there is studies that show that there's like you could transfer, like you're faster at doing some recognition. But I think the benefit honestly has been a bit like exploded in sort of like the public domain, way larger than what like the science claims can back up. So it's sort of like, oh, bilinguals are smarter. But what does that mean? Does that mean that everyone in Barcelona, where there's 2 languages by default, is smarter than everyone in the rest of Spain? No, that of course not. Or like executive functioning, all these things. It's a lot from psychologists, which is great. But the way that they divide up languages, even, it will just be like English, non-English. But what does non-English mean? What does a non-English group mean? We're not controlling for the same variables that like a linguist would control for, right? So we're not getting like a homogeneous group. We're getting like this crazy group of, Mandarin bilinguals and Malay bilinguals, all of these things. Like we're not. So then it's harder to make these sort of big claims for being smart. But even in second language learning research, we know that people that have sort of like these like intrinsic desires to learn language or relearn a language, like relearn a lost heritage language, if they are connected to the culture, even if it's their own culture, or they just have this, you like the culture, you appreciate the culture, you want to connect with people, you want to use it for like social reasons, have higher rates of language learning. They learn it faster because they're so intrinsically motivated to learn. Whereas the extrinsic sort of factors like making more money or to be smarter or all of these things are less sort of influential on like the actual learning because it's coming from outside. But I think the culture, being able just to talk to people, I feel like is such a useful skill. Like if you can speak English and you can speak Mandarin, you can talk to the majority of the world. Like with having those 2 languages, being able to speak English and Mandarin, you can speak to, I forget this, there's some number that says how many people you can speak to. And the number is huge, right? Because Mandarin speakers, there's so many. English speakers, if we include all the non-natives, there's so many. Like you're going to be able to go out to the world and speak to so many people who you wouldn't otherwise be able to speak to if you didn't have a common language. I think that's a big one too.
Yeah, that's why I'm like telling my sister-in-law, I'm pushing my niece. Like she needs to be able to speak 3 languages where it doesn't matter. Sometimes she's confused, and my husband and my kids would speak English to her. I'm like, no. We switch back to Mandarin because we stop. Nobody's going to speak Mandarin to her. Can you imagine she can speak 3 languages, the main languages too, English, Spanish, and Mandarin. It's like she can, speak to so many people, and there's going to be so much advantage for her future. But back to what you were saying, just from the people we interviewed and friends and family, I've never heard of anyone said, oh, I want my kids to learn. For me, majority is Mandarin speakers, parents and friends. I never heard anyone say, oh, because they will be smarter. Always it's either, so I have family in Taiwan, I have family in China, so they can speak to each other and understand each other. Or like for me and a lot of my friends, we want them to feel the closeness to the culture, right? We don't want that to be lost because that's where we came from. And we want them to kind of experience the culture and love the culture too. So I never met anybody that, I want them to be smarter. So I want them to learn. So maybe I just never met any of them yet. Yeah.
I think it's also more of like a second language thing more than a heritage thing because people with a heritage language tend to want the kids to have the heritage, and with parents that maybe aren't native speakers or they only speak one language, then it tends to be about these other benefits like
for the future, right? Like maybe they'll have more opportunity if they want to seek like a career and if they know more language. I do say, but you're right. Like heritage speaker like us, we kind of want that closeness to the culture. And back what you were saying, I agree. We have to make it fun. Because if we don't make it fun, if we don't make it right way, it tends to be really hard. Unless I do see some adult friends that in their adult age, they really don't speak the heritage language, but somehow they got really interested and they went back. Maybe they really like the culture and the country, the dynamic, and they want to go back to work. And that really got them motivated. And I have seen from 0, now they can speak super fluently. I'm like, wow, like you can actually do it when you're an adult, it's just enough of motivation, right?
Yeah, it's all like the motivation. It's like you can learn a language at 80 if you really want to learn a language when you're 80. And you have I think we also know that technically adults are better language learners, which is like kind of backwards. Most people think that babies are these like incredible sponges for learning language. And they do. They learn their language natively. But if we're talking about like a second language, adults have, or like older teenagers, older kids have metalinguistic ability. They have this ability, like we can learn a lot of words in a day, right? Like if you took a 2-year-old and you took an adult and you sat them down and you said, you're going to learn 10 Russian words, the adult's probably going to learn it faster, remember it faster than the 2-year-old, right? Like they're going to have, but the expectation, of course, is way higher, right? When you're comparing a 2-year-old to another 2-year-old, they're not, you can count their words, but an adult, there's going to be like a bigger gap. And so kids also, they take a while to speak, right? Because they have time. I think that's really what they have is babies and kids at home have time, right? Their whole job is to learn. Like playing is their job. Learning, making all these connections in their brain, learning to speak is their full-time job. But of course, as adults, you probably have other commitments that you can't be devoting all of your time to absorbing the language that's around you, being spoken to in a way that's really beneficial, like we do to like babies and small children, how we break down our words, how we elongate our vowels, all of that stuff is so helpful for babies learning. But then for an adult, you're balancing a job, going to classes, sitting down. So you're going to have like a very different sort of experience. But of course, if you want to learn a language or relearn a language that you've sort of lost from your heritage childhood, of course you can do it with like the right motivation, the right amount of time, efforts. It's of course possible.
Okay. Would you say, such as, as people have said, if you've learned the language, right, it's there, even if you think you lost it, because language, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? Even like me living in America, and sometimes when I go back to Taiwan, I have to kind of, what Yao Yao said, kind of take longer pauses or have to reactivate my Mandarin, even though it's my native language. So would you say it's, let's say, my kids, right? Just like right now, I'm trying to raise him bilingual, right? Like I want him to be fluent. But if somehow maybe things happen or he just really fights hard. So let's say I take a long pause, right? Would you say what I had planted is still there? I'm just like trying to see if there's hopes, like, like maybe down the road, like these things are still in there. It just needs to be reactivated.
Yeah, so it depends on the level. So in general, we would find sort of around 15 or 16 is when our language will stabilize to the extent that we're not going to like lose a lot, even if we never use it. So in adults, like adult immigrants, we never will see a complete loss of language, even if they don't use it. What we will see in adults will be vocabulary loss. So having harder time recalling words, not knowing newer words, like lexicon decreases a little bit. Even phonetically, actually, which is interesting because phonetics is the earliest thing we learn. But adults, we know that that's an area actually susceptible to influence from another language. So the more you speak English, it might impact Mandarin, for example. So there is some studies that have shown that adult speakers who have lived really, really long times outside of their country sound not super accented, but they're not 100% native monolingual anymore. So
Yes.
people can hear it in their language that like, oh, this person has lived away from a long time. So those are sort of the two areas we'll see changes in adult speakers. So sort of after 15, 16. But like morphosyntax, grammar, we never really see loss. Younger than that, our language is much more susceptible. So if you leave really, really early and have a complete cutoff, there probably will be a lot of loss depending on the age that it happens. But it's going to be different if it's like a complete loss, like you move away from the country, move away from all speakers, or if it's just a reduction, right? So you move different countries, but your parents continue to speak to it. Like you're not completely cut off. There's also some studies with phonetics, with like adoptees. So kids that were adopted in adulthood or in childhood, really early childhood, grew up completely away from the language, and they were able to hear sounds in the native language in that first language they had for the year before they were adopted. better, but we don't really see much with grammar and with syntax and all of that. So yeah, I would say in general, like as much language as you can give, especially in like the early years, the better. But then being able to sort of maintain, right? So you're going to need more language input at the beginning to get to the level you want to be at. And then after, you need more like maintenance levels, which can often be sort of less. So like complete loss, no, but a detour depending on how old they are when it happens.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because when you're speaking, I'm just thinking about myself. And yes, a lot of people they immigrated here early on. You can hear their accent when they speak Mandarin. You can hear that. I was like, oh, you're probably from America. You have that accent. Like Trista, to me, I feel like she has no accent either language. For myself, and I also think like like you said, like who you hang out with is your parents around speaking Mandarin. Like if you have your community, your group of friends, what language they're speaking to. I moved here when I was 14 and little ashamed of it. I feel like I can converse in both, but I feel I'm not good at both because I moved here when I was 14. So that's middle school level Mandarin. And then I went to school in Florida, but then I moved to Houston when I was 18 and I started hanging out. I was on my own. This is just a long story. I was just on my own. I started hanging out with tons of people who speak Mandarin. So that's only 4 years here to the US and then started speaking Mandarin mainly. And I didn't go to school. I kind of stopped school for a little bit. So I'm like, yeah, it's really important like who you're hanging out with and if you have family that's speaking that language.
Yeah, I would also say in general, people are very concerned about accents and being fluent and being proficient and being dominant, which are all different things, right? So you can be dominant in a language and it be your second language, right? It happens very frequently in the States, for example, with people that move when they're, 18 and then spend sort of the rest of their let's see if I can move this, and then they spend the rest of their life speaking mostly English. They become dominant in English. But accents in general, they're such like a finicky thing and they're such a thing that's so easy to influence, but they're also set very, very, very early. So your accent, some studies like suggest up to 7, other studies suggest they start to be set at like 3 months. Like there's so much variation that I think in general, I would tell parents like your kid's probably going to have an accent. They're probably not going to sound exactly like you when you speak your heritage language. They're going to sound likely influenced by whatever language is the dominant language. So your kid probably will have, if you're in America, will probably have some English accents. I'm Canadian. We do this thing with our vowels. Heritage kids that are Canadian will have this thing brought into their other language. And they might not even sound fully native to somebody else in Canada, for example. They might be like, oh, well, there's traces of this other language, right? So having these two languages, they do influence. And it's a thing. Like if your kid has a bit of an accent, it's okay. Like there's more important sort of things in the world than having an accent, not having an accent, sounding native in both of your languages. Can you speak to your family? Can you converse? Can you do the things that you want your language to do? Can you, sound clear? That's a much, I think, better goal for most parents than their kid to be native, I would say.
I agree because my kids, when they speak Mandarin, they do have that accent coming in, but it's okay. I understand them when they go back and people understand they will know they're probably not native, but that's okay. They can, as long as they can converse, I feel like the accent piece it's all right. Yeah.
Yeah. Some parents have a lot of concerns about their kids having an accent, but there's not much you can do to control the accent. Like everyone, and we also hear a lot of these like, oh, well, my kid doesn't have an accent, or this person I know, my cousin's cousin doesn't have an accent in either language. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. But some people are just good at accents. Like some monolinguals, like actors can do accents, right? Like I can't do it in a British accent, but some people can. So some people will just have native accents. Some people that learn a language at 30 will be so good at pronunciation that they'll masquerade as a native because their accents are so good. But that's sort of the exception, not necessarily the rule of what typically happens.
And I feel like everyone is different. Every kid's different. Some people just have really good language skills. They can speak 5 languages, right? And some may be good at math. They're not really good at language or learning a new language. So I think it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something. There's other more important things I feel like to sort of focus on and focus your
Right.
efforts, and that's probably not one that needs to get a ton of focus.
That's right. All right, thank you, Kat, so much for coming here. Do
Thank
you
you.
have any last encouragement for our listeners from your expertise? You have brought so much value.
Yeah, I feel like it's all about making it a part of your day-to-day life. So making it into small habits, everyday routines, all of those things can be really good. I always say to sort of focus on quality over quantity. So we can get really caught up in that we don't have enough hours in the day or that you're never going to reach 50-50 input, which is never going to happen. So focus on the times that you can focus on. So instead of making it an hour, what can you do in 30 minutes that's really going to be good for language input? Like what games can you play? All of these things where you're really focusing one-on-one with your kid. Try and get as much diversity as you can. So try and get involved in finding peers and finding other places for your kid to be able to connect with their language, connect with their culture. And all of those things will be really helpful in sort of maintaining and keeping up motivation in your long term. And if you have any problems, you can always, ask me, talk to me, DM me, email me.
Yes. Can you share where can we find you? And I will link everything in the show notes too.
Yes. So you can find me on all sort of social medias at Bringing Up Bilinguals, and through their DM and everything else, you can find me, or on my website, which is www.bringingupbilinguals.com. There you have all like the information if you want to work with me and coach with me, to sort of make it a part of your life. If you feel you need some extra help, some extra encouragement, are struggling, not struggling, really want to have a solid plan, you can always find me there.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing all this valuable information, encouragement too, because I love your approach is very positive. You're not like, do this at this age and then there's no chance. It's very positive. I love it.
Yeah, I feel like it has to be. We have to take research and apply it to people where they are. There's no one right way or wrong way to learn a language, to acquire a language. If it happens in babyhood, fantastic. How can we maintain it? If it happens when the kid's 7, great. How can we maintain it? How can we make the best of the circumstances that life's brought you and make it really a part of your life? I think is the only way to do it. Otherwise, you got to be positive. You got to be, you can do it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. If anyone's struggling, we need to find you on Instagram and ask for help.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for listening. Your time is so valuable. So I'm really grateful you spent this time with us. If you like our podcast, make sure you subscribe. We will have a lot more amazing guests coming on to share, tell their stories, share their expertise. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Also, make sure you check our show notes to grab our freebie and check out our courses that we have for you. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. It's Mandarin Together Now. If you have any suggestions and to support us, any encouragement, would you please leave us a review? We would love to see your comments and support. Thank you. See you next time.